The 1960s culture. Culture in the 1960s was so rich with creative innovations, new concepts, art and music that painted the way for the future. This decade was seen as a time period of new movies, music, and more that changed how Americans live in present day. The question still remains, how were these things so influential to the culture, and what was the reason this decade was such a creative outlet? This documentary will include how music, fashion, political movements, and the hippie movements affected the culture in the 1960s. First, we're just going to dive right into music in the 1960s. Many monumental events led to the change in direction of music, such as the assassination of President Kennedy, the climax of the Vietnam War, and many successes of civil rights movements. The music started to show these victories in culture with the British invasions, which was the beginning of popularity for groups such as the Beatles. This new wave of music changed how people view these political situations and the culture altogether. The 1960s is also where rock music started to evolve as it is today. Another great innovation of the 1960s was the 78 RPM shellac disc, which was a flat record that played at a speed of 78 revolutions per minute. The materials to create these discs were limited during World War II, so many records were made with shellac resin. This led to more competition with music in this era because every new uprising band or group wanted their songs to be put on a record. Many monumental songs came out in the 1960s, and it is documented that hundreds of millions of iconic singles were created in this time, such as A Sunday Kind of Love by Etta James and Ain't That a Kick in the Head by Dean Martin. Being noticed by the general public as a musician was solely based on their ability to get played on the radio in heavy rotation. Many radio stations were overplaying records, and in order for musicians to not be out of work, these stations played less and less records, making being a musician a more and more competitive job. Next, we're going to be covering the fashion in the 1960s and how this influenced many movements and the culture altogether. The fashion for women in this decade had many different faces of style, such as Jackie Kennedy and Twiggy, that carved out the pop culture of fashion in this time. The 1960s can be compared to the 1920s flapper revolution, because many ideas of fashion were coming away from the more modest views that were primarily in the 50s. According to VintageDancer.com, Jackie Kennedy quoted, "There was no such thing as too short." Jackie Kennedy was a style icon in this decade, and her signature look was a well-fitted matching skirt and blouse set that were buttoned and very professional. This look would usually be paired with matching accessories and low-heeled shoes. This style enthusiast set the tone for how women should dress all over the United States, and her fashion was copied tastefully. Another fashion trend of the 1960s were kitten heel pumps, Mary Jane strap shoes, and sneakers. This led to the next style of the 60s, called 60s youth quake culture. This was heavily influenced by younger generations because there were so many teens after the baby boom. This style consisted of bright colors and shapeless dresses. It was also incorporated into hair, makeup, and altogether culture and the vibe of the 1960s. These fashion trends influenced the culture of the 60s by giving more power and confidence to women after and during the war efforts. Many shorter dresses were in style during this period, which gave the whole decade a more liberal tone all throughout it. The next topic I'll be covering is historical movements and the hippies. Many historical movements took place in the 1960s, such as civil rights movement and the rise of the hippies. Both of these events affected the culture in monumental ways, leading to anti-war protests and political assassinations. The civil rights movement was a war of equality for all races and social justice. During the Civil War, slavery was abolished, but there were still many laws put into act that held African Americans and many other minorities back, such as the Jim Crow laws. The civil rights movement was really an advancement in equality and the state of any movements we have today, such as Black Lives Matter campaign. This fight for justice spanned all throughout the 1960s and even the 70s, and even had support from many white activists. Many advancements in equality and culture also took place during this decade. Many African Americans took leadership positions that they had previously not been allowed to be in, and amendments and laws were created to make African Americans equal to whites. Many important activists greatly affected the culture of the 1960s, such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., by fighting for equality and their rights. Another huge movement that took place during this era was the legacy of the hippies and the ideas that rooted from their beliefs. This culture was started on many college campuses and flooded throughout all of the United States. This movement affected music, fashion, and most importantly, culture. These people stayed away from materialism and the wave of repression that developed their own distinctive culture and way of living. Their fashion was typically psychedelic colors and loose clothing that was very non-restrictive. These people typically had primarily vegetarian diets and practiced holistic medicine. This culture also influenced many anti-war movements because they believed in peace, not war. This influenced the culture by giving society another view on things rather than the mainstream materialism and pro-war efforts. The 1960s were filled with an amazing rich culture of fashion, music, political movements, and history that plowed the way for a lot of things that are taken for granted in modern times. This decade was a similar time, yet it was still the beginning of modern technology and research that is currently available. The culture was molded by post-war efforts and social movements that greatly impacted everything in the society and culture of the 1960s. This decade was one of the most influential decades of all times. It molded our way of thinking and changed it to be more accepting of different races and cultures and different sexualities. 1960s fun facts. Number 1. The FDA approved the world's first commercially produced birth control pill. Number 2. The 1960s Summer Olympics were held in August with Rome as the host city. For the first time, the games were televised in 18 European countries. Number 3. A slice of pizza cost 15 cents. A McDonald's hamburger was also 15 cents, and candy bars were 5 cents apiece. Number 4. Over 90% of American households have at least one TV. And number 5. The starting salary for a teacher was $5,135 a year. And that's all. Thank you so much for watching my cringy documentary. And these are my sources. Thank you. Mwah.